And you get to drop your lowest quiz grade. That's right. Okay, now here's a sign-up sheet. There's only one. I can't screw this up. Going around. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. One thing I want to tell you is that the reading kind of picks up in intensity from here. And that just means I am, of course, an English major, and so, when I was an undergraduate, it meant carrying a bag like this around. I know it looks like the same bag. It's not, but it's stuffed full of books that I read all the time, and whenever I had odd moments. I still kind of do that, but it's more because I'm neurotic, not because I'm a student. I completely think that that would be the way to go for you, to make sure that you're kind of always have that book at hand and always sort of a little bit ahead of the curve. I think it'll help you once we get to midterms and kind of head towards the end. I tried to build in, it's not that, I do love poetry, but the reason the class is heavily geared towards poetry is because novels are long, and I wanted to make sure that you could focus on the poems and such, and we didn't have as much to read. Okay, so I have two things I want to talk about at the end of the book, and maybe have a conversation about. They both are ways in which I see, that's cute, I like that, that's good. That was my doggy, I'm sorry, my dog always makes strange noises. There's two things I want to talk about and one kind of extra piece that might find its way in. So the first two things I want to talk about are Romanticism as a collaborative discourse. That word discourse is kind of funny. It means both talking and writing, but it also means a kind of practice. Like what we do when we're teaching in here is a discourse, because it's also a kind of practice, a kind of way of listening and connecting. So I write up there that I think you must not become too defended in order to maintain this case. So before we go ahead and think about what that might mean, I'll just kind of talk my way through these 2 points I have, and then we'll come back. So I'm going to mention point 1, which is it's a collaborative discourse. Mary, Shelley, Percy, Shelley, Byron, Leigh Hunt, John Keats, all of these writers are writing and sending their writing to each other, and they're actually, in the case of Mary and Percy, they're collaborating on stuff. They're writing in the same book, so you can't even tell where one person's hand ends and the other ends. One begins and the other ends. The second main point I want to make after I talk about Romanticism as a collaborative discourse and a kind of process of remaining open to experience is this one about the anti-hero hero. As a way to kind of think about this, I decided we would look at a little bit of this movie, which if you haven't seen it, you should see it because it's pretty amazing, called Joker. And I want to sort of suggest the Joker is a Frankensteinish creature. I wonder why that doesn't goes like that. I guess that's fine. That's good enough. We can see it. This is just kind of, wait, maybe I shouldn't play this. This is like a spoiler. Hold on. Let me find the trailer. I've got the trailer, so that will this is actually a number of the trailer scenes. It's not just one. Oh my God, please stop. Okay, here we go.
There's something special about you, Arthur, I can tell. Where are you from?
I live right here in the city with my mother. She says I was put here to spread joy and laughter.
What's so funny?
She always tells me to smile and put on a happy face.
Rated R.
So it goes through an iteration of the different trailers. That's all it really is. Because I don't want to spoil it for anyone.
Is something funny? Stand out, freak!
Rated R.
It's this last one, I think, that best captures the kind of quality I'm talking about.
Arthur, I have some bad news for you. This is the last time we'll be meeting.
You don't listen, dude. You just ask the same questions every week. How's your job? Are you having any negative thoughts? All I have are negative thoughts. When I was a little boy and told people I was going to be a comedian, everyone laughed at me. Well, no one's laughing now.
You can say that again, pal.
So awful, isn't it?
In my whole life, I didn't know if I even really existed. But I do. People are starting to notice.
Think this is funny? Is this a joke to you?
Murray, one small thing.
Yeah.
When you bring me out, can you introduce me as Joker? Send in the clouds.
Okay. How many people have seen this movie? Oh, great, good. A lot of you. Okay, good. So you'll be already familiar with my sort of take. So even if you don't read comic books and you saw the earlier Dark Knight trilogy, you have a different understanding of how, in that trilogy, it was very unclear what created the Joker, and partly because the Heath Ledger Joker tells different stories, and so then you're like in a place that this is what we would call in literary criticism an unreliable narrator. So you don't really know whether or not what's happening here. Here we have a pretty reliable narrator, and I think in this movie, the Joker, you have a pretty reliable narrator. You get to see. There's one place that slips, and I won't tell you about that, but that has more to do not with how it's created, but the kind of psychology of the Joker and what's happening inside of him. How actually, it's not a question about whether or not he's traumatized and brutalized. The question is, what are the effects of that trauma and brutalization? And that is not necessarily clear in the narration, but until the end. But certainly the way he gets brutalized and traumatized, that's clear. And it's not clear in the earlier version. So what it does is it shifts things a little bit. When you kind of have an understanding of how this kind of, what we might call evil, and the creature himself calls himself evil. He says, I have become evil, right? He doesn't say I was born evil. He doesn't say, you made me, Victor made me evil. He says at the end to Walton, I have become evil. So there's a sense in which I want to sort of suggest that the novel opens up a question for us that's still obviously here with us because we have it in this film, which is like, a big cultural sort of object. And the question is, who creates the evil, or who creates that, right? So this was now. So the question becomes, okay, that's fine, Dr. Rudman. So what you're saying is that there's a relationship between the way culture treats people in certain positions and then how they react to that. So you've established that. Okay, we believe you on that. But what about the idea of an anti-hero? At what point does that person who is traumatized become somebody we root for because of these things? And that's a different story. And I want to suggest that the seeds of that anti-hero position are even there when Shelley writes the novel. It's not like we have to wait for them to be born. We don't have to wait until after Byron to get the Byronic hero, who's a kind of anti-hero. In fact, you get it in Charlotte Smith in this text. So look at the sonnet that I handed out to you. And I had said when I first started, you can see that in fact, this text was written more or less contemporaneous, not with Frankenstein's birth, but the novel, but with Mary Shelley's birth, right, 1799. So here you go. It reads, is there a solitary wretch who hies to the tall cliff, with starting pace or slow, and, measuring, views with wild and hollow eyes its distance from the waves that chide below? Who, as the sea-born gale with frequent sighs chills his cold bed upon the mountain turf, with hoarse, half-uttered lamentation lies murmuring responses to the dashing surf? In moody sadness, on the giddy brink, I see him more with envy than with fear. He has no nice felicities that shrink from giant horrors, wildly wandering here. He seems, uncursed with reason, not to know the depth or duration of his woe. So what you get here is this idea, right? So clearly, as I understand the basic semantic content of the poem, it's like, okay, Mrs. Smith, you can go, why don't you take a walk on the beach here? I don't know where they were, someplace on the coast of England, and said, go for a walk here. And she's like, but we need to warn you, people have seen a kind of crazy person wandering around. And at the time, the situation with mental health was such, as it is kind of unfortunately still, that many people are not getting the treatment they need, and he's just wandering around. Right? It's possible. But she takes this as an occasion to think about the fact that she has reason, and that he is not burdened with reason. So there's a sense in which reason envies unreason. Right? So there's a sense in which that anti-hero structure is being articulated in this poem already. That unreason becomes something to wish for, because reason only points us back to our own predicament. Right? It's probably the same reason why many of us, like I said last time, don't necessarily read the news every day. Right? Because just to know it just seems like too much. It's too much of a reminder of what a predicament we're in. So that's the way I would sort of think about it. And she says, it's as though the creature remains unworried about guilt and salvation. Okay, so that would be my main point about this hero anti-hero sort of structure, is that we find it. Remember, we've already found the kind of psychological explanation of it in Blake, that a repression of our own let's just say, unattractive impulses. A repression of those leads to an acting out or a blaming of others or something like that. So we've already found that explanation in Blake. Now we have contemporaneous with Blake in the same decade that he's writing Songs of Innocence and Experience, we have Charlotte Smith articulating an envy for that unreason, an envy for that, a feeling trapped in a false narrative of heaven without a counter-narrative of hell, of our own internalized hell. So she's already being able to articulate that. And then I think the next step is for Mary Shelley to write this novel and give us a fully fledged, fully born literary character who represents this for us and can actually articulate it, right? So what do we get? We get this. It's in the very end when he's speaking to Walton. We're volume 3, chapter 7. And he says that he is a fallen angel who has become a malignant devil. So he articulates his own Miltonic story. This is the story of Satan in Paradise Lost by John Milton. So I'm starting it's at the bottom of my 154. I don't know what page it's on for you, but it's in, once again, volume 3, chapter 7, the paragraph that begins, "You who call Frankenstein your friend. You who call Frankenstein your friend seem to have a knowledge of my crimes and my misfortunes, but in the detail which he gave you of them, he could not sum up the hours and months of misery which I endured, wasting in impotent passions. For whilst I destroyed his hopes, I did not satisfy my own desires. They were ever ardent and craving. Still I desired love and friendship, and I was still spurned. Was there no injustice in this? Am I to be thought the only criminal when all humankind sinned against me? Why do you not hate Felix, who drove his friend to his door with contumely, I'm not sure how to pronounce that word. Why do you not execrate the rustic who sought to destroy the savior of his child? Nay, these are virtuous and immaculate beings. I, the miserable and the abandoned, am an abortion, to be spurned at and kicked and trampled on. Even now my blood boils at the recollection of this injustice." All right? That's what you get. You get this whole articulation of what it feels like from his position to be rejected merely on the basis of the way he looks. Actually, I can't think of another single reason to reject him except the way that he looks. There's a great movie which is semi-historical. There's a lot of problems with the his story, but it's a David Lynch film called Elephant Man. And that's another articulation. If you haven't seen it, you should see Elephant Man. If you hate black and white movies, don't watch it. But it's pretty beautiful and pretty sad, but it's an articulation of somebody who doesn't look like anyone else and is completely rejected on this basis. So my final thing I'd like to do now before we move on to my second point, which so I kind of went backwards. I talked about this kind of anti-hero part first, and then I'm going to come back to a collaborative writing practice, romanticism as a collaborative writing practice, where all the authors are sending their poems to each other and correcting them and writing them and collaborating, right? Because that sets us up for a way of thinking about what happens when that disappears, which is kind of what happened in literary culture. I mean, it flowers again for moments, like literary communities do. But largely, I think if you think about, like, when you think about your image of a writer, somebody alone at their desk writing, right? Or somebody alone and like Shelley alone in his boat writing, or something like that. You don't think about people gathered around together, collectively working on things and sending them and sharing them. All right. So, but before I do any of that, what I want to do is model for you some of the close reading techniques that I'm going to want you to do in your paper. All right? So I thought this would be a good chance, since we have two poems here, this one, Immutability, to take a little bit of time and ask you to, along with me, do a kind of close reading of the poem. So, I've already said a lot about its arguments, and pretty much in the close reading, I'm going to ask you to set that argument aside and focus on its form. Right? I'm really going to ask you to think about the way the language works in the poem, the way that the choices the author made in terms of sound patterning, the way that the terms that the author used in terms of rhyme patterns, etc. So the first thing to say is that the poem announces to you that it's a sonnet. All right. So if you're writing a close reading paper, you'd want to say, this is a sonnet by Charlotte Smith. Now, do you have to know all the different conventions of sonnets? No, I don't care about that. I mean, if you're English majors, yeah, you should know that, and I'll be glad to talk to you about that. But no, you don't need to know that right now. All you need to know is it's a sonnet. That means it's 14 lines. Okay. All right. So let's think about, so another thing not to worry about too much, don't worry about printer's conventions. So that means don't worry about the fact that these, some of these lines are inset and others are not. That's a printer's convention. It's not something that when Charlotte Smith wrote it, she said, I know, I'm going to make the second and fourth lines go in a little bit. It's just a printer's convention. She wrote it out as a sonnet in her book, okay? So that's the second thing. I have a problem, which is I lost my good stylus, and this one is crappy, so even as bad as I usually write, I'm going to write a lot worse, okay? So just bear with me. And they don't have one in the bookstore. What kind of university is this? All right. Okay. Is there a solitary wretch who hies to the tall cliff? I believe hies. I didn't never look this word up. I've always assumed in the basis of where it's at that it means kind of like stays close. Right? Stays close. We'll say for that for the main theme. Okay. For the time being. So the rhyme scheme. Who wants to tell us what the rhyme scheme is? Yes. A B, and then what? So that's the first four lines are A B. C D. Okay. What's next? E F G. Right. So it's a Shakespearean sonnet. It's a basic Shakespearean sonnet. 3 quatrains rhymed. Quatrains just means 4 lines. 3 sets of 4 rhyme A B. At the end, that's the end. We're just looking at the last end word and the way it's rhymed. A B, C D, E F G. So it's basic sonnet. So the first thing you could say is it's a pretty conventional sonnet. All right. And that would be a good thing to say, that in many ways it's a conventional sonnet. You can see how badly this writes, but whatever. All right. So, does anybody remember what I said when you're reading a poem? And remember, you don't have to do a poem. You can do a passage from Frankenstein if you'd rather do prose. Okay, that's fine. Or even one from one of the novels we're going to read. You've already read it or are going to read it in the future. Okay. Does anybody remember what I said when the poem comes to the end of the line and it doesn't stop at the end of the line but continues on to the next line? What that's called? Enjambment. Good. Enjambment. So one of the things that's really interesting about this poem is it begins with an enjambment. That's pretty interesting. It would be sort of like starting a song with an odd measure in it toward the beginning, not even giving you time to get into the rhythm of it before it kind of changes it. Not that it sounds unrhythmical. I read it, right, and it sounded pretty rhythmical, but it doesn't conform to the usual rhythms. Do you see what I mean? Usually, like in a Shakespearean sonnet, it would say, "Oh, never say that I was false of heart." Pause. Though absent seemed my claim to qualify. Pause, right? Because those are called end stopped when they're not enjambed. Listen to this. Is there a solitary wretch who hies to the tall cliff? Right? Right through it, right? Right through it. And when you do that, what's the effect? How does it feel different? Does it sound more poetic or more like regular speech? Regular speech, exactly. So we're starting to get the contours of a first paragraph of a close reading paper. You see what I mean? We have the first part. We say something like the poem on I think you could just say on being cautioned, right? You can shorten it. The sonnet On Being Cautioned by Charlotte Smith is a more or less conventional sonnet, except that when it begins, the first line isn't jammed and you read right through it to the middle of the next line, right? Where you have, what's that thing called again? Where break in the middle of the poem? Caesura, yes, a caesura, which is spelled like this, the giant pen, sorry. Giant, like, marker. It's like trying to write with my left hand. Caesura, right, a cut in the line. So what does that mean? It just means, you don't have to say much. You could say something like, after that, you could say, the effect of this is that it sounds more like plain speech. It draws the reader in to a regular kind of question, an everyday question about the nature of what's happening here. Okay. So now I'm picking up this. One thing I will say, I'm gonna take this poem and take it off of the list of poems for you to analyze because we're kind of doing it together, so it's kind of not fair. All right. With starting, pace, and slow, I think if I'm to look up the usage of starting here, I'm gonna think that it means something like starting and stopping, like or unregular, like starting pace, like this, right? And you can imagine so it's either a hit and miss pace or a very slow pace. So let's talk a little bit about the sound in those first few lines, okay? So because we've already established that it's pretty weird to have that in jam minute. Now, so let's talk about the sound. So just listen now as I read these lines. Is there a solitary wretch who hies to the tall cliff with starting pace and slow? What sounds kind of jump out to you? Are there consonant or vowel sounds that jump out to you? Yes.
T into the tall.
The which?
T.
The T that comes, solitary wretch who hies to the tall cliff. Yeah, to the tall cliff. Why does it stand out to you, do you think?
Just,
What?
I don't know.
I don't know. Okay. All right. Do you want to let's do a little thinking about why it might stand out. Okay. If the rest of the poem is lacking a hard sound, a hard consonant sound, and you finally reach a hard consonant sound, it's just like a starting pace. It's like an uneven pace. It kind of goes fast, and then you have to stop a little bit when you get to the tall cliff. Do you want to know why else tall cliff rings out to you? Because there are two stresses in a row. Usually poetry goes unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress. Poetry of this period, not today poetry's all over the place. But when they were writing in an iambic pentameter, which he was mostly doing, it was da 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 da. Is there a solitary wretch who hies, right? To the tall cliff. Unstressed, unstressed, stressed, stressed. To the tall cliff. You hear that rhythm? So now you've got like the whole first page almost, right, of your close reading. That she starts it and she reproduces in the very language the sound of somebody starting and stopping. You see what I mean? That's why you don't need any complex argument. You just, whatever the text gives you, whatever the sound of the text gives you, that's what you stay true to that. You go, go, oh yes, poem, I'm gonna stay true to you. You are gonna like tell me how to read you. You're gonna teach me how to read you, and I'm gonna teach the people who read my paper how to read you, because I've learned from you how to read you, rather than some other way. I'm paying really close attention to all these different like kinds of things. When you don't know what it's called, like I don't know what it's called when you have two stresses in a row like that. You could look it up on Google, and there's about a 40% chance you'll get the wrong answer. So I suggest you send me an email, or you come by my office hours. I don't know why office hours this term. I don't know why I'm being really stubborn about it. Partly because when you actually have office hours, nobody ever comes. But if you don't, then they just come and they go, oh, send a good copy. I go, okay, let's go. But anyway, you come and you talk to me, and I will tell you that that first part is a Pyrrhic with no two unstressed syllables to the and then tall cliff, right? And maybe I'll say I don't hear it the way you do. Tell me why you hear it that way, and you tell me. And if your reason is convincing, then you can say that. You just say, although other people might disagree with me, I hear this as da 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 da, and this is why. As long as you have some reason in the poem, then that's what's cool about meter, that kind of interpretation. Same thing if you go into music theory or musicology. You can make all kinds of arguments about, this is a really harsh sounding symphony, as long as you can point to the ways that that's harsh to you. Okay? Any questions about this? So we just did, that's enough. I mean, we did just 2 lines, right? You can easily write 4 pages of close reading if you do this kind of detail and you really throw yourself into it. Okay? And don't worry about Charlotte Smith was an author who was a woman who was born in the 18th century, and she had really bad luck with men, and all kind of true. You don't need to write all that stuff. You don't need to write it. You just jump right into the close reading. And at the end, you don't have to say, so, I have proven, da-da-da-da-da. No, just end it. Just like, end, don't stop. Just like, okay, now I'm going to the gym. Right? Yeah, as long as you covered the poem, that's fine. Boom. Good. Done. Any other questions about that? Okay, let's go to my second argument, which I think is, it's not an argument, it's just a sort of statement, because I didn't really even talk to you about this. Take a look at this that I handed out to you. Okay? So what I want you to see here, a couple things. One is we can be quite impressed with Mary Shelley, 19-year-old Mary Shelley, who's writing an entire novel with very few corrections and just put it out in her journal. We can be impressed by that. But the other thing I want you to get is that if you turn the page of this, and by the way, her hand is really easy to read, because I worked with the manuscript stuff. I was working on one of her husband's poems, and his writing was very difficult to read, but she did what's called his fair copy. She copied out, and it was in her hand. So much easier to read. So another reason to read Mary Shelley is it's easier to read in manuscript, right? And when you're holding the poem, or I was reading a facsimile. I wasn't at the Bodleian Library. I was holding a facsimile. So I want you to get the fact that what these writers were doing was, you know what, I'm going to do this, will work better. So Romanticism is a collaborative discourse. I've already told you about Wordsworth and Coleridge, right? Writing lyrical ballads together. I've now told you about Mary and Percy Shelley. But what's really, really almost more interesting here is that Mary and Percy Shelley attempted to make their everyday life like their writing. So in other words, and maybe Wordsworth and Coleridge did a little bit too, but they, what I'm trying to suggest is there's a way in which this collaborative thing, so how am I trying to say this? What I'm trying to say is that there's a way in which this collaborative process is sort of radically democratic and radically open and egalitarian, and we share with one another, right? So it'd be like sort of like if you and I were going to write a text together, and we would both sort of like write parts and hand it back and forth like that. What would it be like if we also practiced, I don't know, governance of this university like this? You see what I'm saying? Where the deans and the provosts didn't make decisions, but the students did. You know what I mean? Like, what classes do you guys want to take? How should we do this? Right? How should we organize the classes? Should they be inside or outside? Right? Should we have books and whatever, or should we have more music? How should we do it? Right? So you guys were more included in that process than what you end up getting is something more like what I think what the Shelleys were thinking about. So at the very birth of Frankenstein, you have Byron, Polidori, Leigh Hunt had visited. It doesn't matter if you don't know who that was. He's just another writer, English writer. Keats, writing back and forth to Keats. Shelley's writing Keats. Keats comes to Italy, but mostly just to die. He never saw Shelley there. I think Shelley might have died shortly before Keats. I always got it confused, but I think so. He had hoped when he left to visit Shelley, but we'll deal with Percy Shelley more later. But that's the basic understanding. Is that Romanticism becomes a collaborative discourse. So you can imagine it's like the utopian idea that the creature has is that he could enter into a family-like relationship, a kind of collaboration with Victor, with the de Lacys, with these different people. And the dream of the novel, remember, both of her parents are radical political writers who believe in a radical democratic open society where people are deciding things together. Her mother is perhaps the first real feminist writing in English in any voluminous amount. She wrote a lot, right? So that's where it's coming from, and it comes to this idea of unfairness that the creature articulates. So this utopian ideal, they're trying to live in their lives. Now, I'll tell you that it was really problematic. They had money where other people didn't. They made choices that probably resulted, you'll read this elsewhere if you read about the Shelley's lives, they made choices that probably resulted in the death of both of their infants, the second two, right? Because they took them to places where there was malaria, you know what I'm saying, that they probably didn't make some wise choices, right? But setting that aside for a second, not condoning it, but just setting it aside for a second, what they were trying to do in terms of a radical experiment in living is pretty interesting. It's part of the history of Romanticism. And it's both something that the Victorians later, because this is a Brit literature class, the Victorians later pushed back against and called them childish and so forth, right? So one of the things that I want to argue is that, so are there any questions about what I just said? I think it's pretty clear, yeah? That this radical collaborative process is supposed to produce and be part of a radical kind of living situation, which would then become possibly this utopian way of being in the world. I think the thing to say, though, is like what stands in our way? What stands in our way from having a more collaborative kind of situation? Ego. Ego stands in the way. Percy Shelley it would be like, you just look and do some of the corrections or the notes he writes back to her, or like, nobody really asked you. Like, shut up, like, whatever. She did ask him, but it's not, sometimes you just want to write and not have anybody comment, right? Same thing with, Shelley. Shelley was very kind to Keats, but other people were very mean to Keats. So, ego can get in the way, right? Saying really bad things about your poetry or whatever. Ego can get in the way. The need to, like I said before, they had money, they could do this. People without money, it's not called utopianism, it's called, we all need to milk the animals, and we all need to pick the things, and we all need to do whatever, because we don't means, right? So it's kind of called, it's not so pretty when it's like that, it's just called agrarian, poverty peasant life. It's not as pretty as the utopian version where you get to write poems and drink wine and stuff. So that's the other thing that stands in the way. The third thing that I think stands in the way is how to remain open in the face of all these things. Like, what if Victor had remained open to the possibility? Not like necessarily, oh, I embrace you, my creature, but instead like, okay, let me think about this, because I now see that there are, he was open, but there was too defensive almost from the beginning. So how do we keep our defenses down? And what are we defending against? One argument would be we're defending against the idea that, we're defending at a very broad level against the very knowledge of our own deaths and the fact that we're going to die. So this is something that is a kind of way to understand this. And what they talked about in the 19th century was the concept of mutability. And that's what this poem is about. So I want to sort of like read this Shelley poem with you. There's also a sonnet by Wordsworth called Mutability. It's a great later sonnet. I don't like a lot of his later sonnets, but this is a beautiful one called Mutability. So here is and you have this one, I handed it out to you. We are as clouds that veil the midnight moon. How restlessly they speed and gleam and quiver, streaking the darkness radiantly. Yet soon night closes round and they are lost forever. Or like forgotten lyres whose dissonant strings give various response to each varying blast, to whose frail frame no second motion brings one mood or modulation like the last. We rest. A dream has power to poison sleep. We rise. One wandering thought pollutes the day. We feel, conceive, or reason, laugh, or weep, embrace fond woe, or cast our cares away. It is the same, for, be it joy or sorrow, the path of its departure still is free. Man's yesterday may ne'er be like his morrow. Not may endure, but mutability. All right, so just a couple of things. When the poet uses an apostrophe inside of a polysyllabic word and makes it monosyllabic, or if it's trisyllabic, makes it disyllabic, like the word ne'er instead of never, it's called a number of things. You can call it ellipsis, but you can also call it syncope. S-Y-N-C-O-P-E, syncope. That's when you collapse this word ne'er into never, and you just give the poet that. It's hard to write in rhythm, so you go, okay, yeah, that's fine. We know that really means never, but we'll call it ne'er, okay? All right, lyres. Who knows what a lyre is? What's a lyre?
It's an instrument.
An instrument, yeah. What's it like?
It has, it's like a weird, almost like a U shape.
Yeah, it's like the body of a guitar, and it actually is strung kind of like a guitar, like the strings across this way. And the idea was that poets in Greece would play the lyre whenever they would sing their poems. So the lyre became, for the Romantic poets, for Coleridge, especially Coleridge and and Shelley, who both use this metaphor, it becomes a metaphor for poetic song or poetic inspiration. But the lyre was also called an Aeolian harp, and that was not something you played so much as put outside like a wind chime, and the strings would vibrate when the wind would blow across it. And it did sound dissonant, which is what he says. So I really think he's thinking of that. It was so popular, it was sort of like, think of Alexa. It was sort of like everybody had one in their garden, right? Everybody had an Aeolian lyre in the garden, and when the wind would blow, instead of wind chimes, you would hear this really crazy sound. It's not pleasant. It's really, really crazy. It's not like they tuned the strings. And it's just like, it's a, oh my God, and so, but they liked it, right? They kind of liked it, and it was kind of like, whatever. And so when he says, or like forgotten lyres, whose dissonant strings give various response to varying blast, he's basically suggesting that, and Coleridge is the one, I don't think we read this poem in this class, but Coleridge has a passage in Aeolian Harp that says, "But what if all of animated nature be but organic harps, diversely framed, that tremble into thought as o'er them blows, or as o'er them," I can't remember what the verb is there, but passive, blows over, plastic and plastic and vast, one intellectual breeze, right? At once the soul of each and God of all. So the idea is, what if we were all just harps, and God just plays across us, and our life is just about opening ourselves to this inspiration, and it plays across us. Not only that, Shelley says in Defense of Poetry that maybe my harp harmonizes with your harp, and yours harmonizes with his, and his harmonizes with hers, and we're all kind of like vibrating together in this beautiful kind of crazy sounding symphony, dissonant but beautiful at the same time, right? It's a kind of harmony, but it's not controlled. Does that make any sense? It's not controlled by us. It's controlled by God or whatever. And that's what he can say at the end of that little passage from Aeolian Harp, at once the soul of each and God of all. Somehow in his thing, he can preserve the idea that you can have your own autonomy, have your own song, and be in harmony. It's not, there's no difference in it. I think this is a very beautiful idea. A very beautiful idea, and I think it's part of this collaborative thing I'm talking about. That's why I can collaborate with you, and you can collaborate with each other, and we can collaborate with people that are not in this room. Because we are diversely framed, and yet we are all responding to the same breeze. The same breeze blows through all of us, so it doesn't matter our differences. So you know what, creature? The same breeze blows through you, even though it sounds different to me. And in fact, we can harmonize these. We don't. It's not that we can harmonize. We do harmonize. I don't have to make it happen. It just does happen naturally. That's the idea of the poem. But mutability means, right, change. Change means death. So if you buy onto this, you have to accept that, right? That I think is, and this is all throughout Shelley. Shelley is just like, make me an instrument. He says make me an instrument, but you know when he gets that, he must get it. Does anybody know the St. Francis prayer? It goes something like, and I'm not Christian, so I don't know why I know it, but it says something like, God, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is unhappiness, let me bring this. Where there is that, let me bring this. And then he goes on. I mean, it's like he's like, rather than be comforted, let me comfort. Rather, like he becomes like, rather than people agreeing with me, let me agree with others. Like he's like really this beautiful kind of selfless movement, which I guess is what St. Francis was all about, right? Besides the birds and bees, right? You know that they and that's it. That's the collaborative part. right? They were early romantics, right, or proto-romantics, the Franciscan order, right? He and his fellow monks, these guys, the Vatican said to them, you know what, Francis or his followers, you know what, guys, you're just kind of living out in the open, like under the trees, and the church doesn't feel very comfortable. It doesn't look good for the church. So we'd really like you to have a monastery, like a house somewhere where you would live together. And they go, no. The cows don't have monasteries. The birds don't have monasteries. We're not going to have monasteries. We're creatures of the earth. And they're like, so the church thinks about it. They go, okay, I'll tell you what. We'll rent you the place. We'll buy it, and so you don't have to have it, and you can live there for free, and we'll pay whatever. And they're like, oh, no, you can't trick us. That's still property. That still belongs to somebody. It's not all free. You see what I mean? So they were like the creatures. They couldn't connect with the Vatican on that. All right. If you were to write about this poem, and you can, since I haven't done anything, you've already be able to see that there's lots of cool aspects to the poem. I mean, really interesting kinds of repetitions, really interesting kinds of sound values and things like that. So let me end by saying the last thing. So I think that this novel basically gives us two basic things to take away besides all the other stuff, right? And they are the ones I mentioned before. The idea that you have in the creature one of the first real anti-hero heroes. And this creature, the more just our society becomes, please God, the more just our society becomes, the less sympathetic this guy is. Do you see what I mean? The less we buy. But in a kind of unjust world, it's easier to embrace an anti-hero like this. That's why in the movie The Joker, the complete dystopian state of Gotham makes sense. It makes sense that that's how we do things. Okay? So that's the first one. The second one has to do with collaboration and the ethos of collaboration, interconnectedness, liars or hearts that resonate together, right? And the last thing I'll say is I still think that there's an immense amount of fear of collaborative work and valuing the work that happens in collective, and still a kind of old idea of the kind of genius working alone somewhere and not collaborating with others, right? I think that's problematic, and I think it's problematic on a political level, I think it's problematic on an artistic level. I think it often makes bad art on top of everything else. I think a lot of really good art comes from deep interconnection, etc. And I think that's another legacy of the Romantic period. Have a good week. I'll see you later. Oh, pick this up on the way out of the room, please. This is your reading for Monday.